I'm Bob Kiter. I've got the pleasure of directing the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. Let me welcome both our audience in the room. Thank you for joining us today. At least none of us had to fight the weather conditions that we've been dealing with for the last 3 days. We've got a bright sunshine day here in Salt Lake City, finally. I think most of us would agree. And welcome to those of you who are online joining us. We're pleased to have you with us today. Let me begin with our traditional native lands acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. A couple announcements about future Stegner Center events coming up next week. We will have with us on Tuesday, April 11th, Ann Palmer, who holds an PhD degree. She's the author of Years of Promise, the University of Utah's A. Roy Ray Open Years. That is a history from 1946 to 64 of the university. She was founding director of the University of Utah's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, is currently at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education. She's going to be presenting on letters that she's recently come upon from the young Wallace Stegner, the namesake of the Stegner Center. The title of her talk is Corresponding with the Young Wallace Stegner. The next day, if you're enjoying your pizza here today, you can have it 2 days in a row. That was a joke, yeah, okay. So the next day we have a film about Stuart Udall, entitled Stuart Udall, The Politics of Beauty. It's one of the initial screenings of this film, which was just recently released. We're doing it in partnership with the Department of Communication here at the law school, and we'll be joined by John DeGraff, who's the filmmaker. And after the film, we'll have a discussion with him. So that's next week, Tuesday and Wednesday. Today's lecture, as I think all of you know, is on Bears Ears, Landscape of Refuge and Resistance. We're pleased to have with us Andrew Gulliford, who's a professor of history and environmental studies at Fort Lewis College in Durango. Most importantly, he has published just recently a book by the same title. Through the University of Utah Press. Copies of the book are available for sale outside, and Dr. Gulliford is very pleased to sign them afterwards. As noted, he's a professor of history and environmental studies at Fort Lewis College in Durango. He's been awarded there the Roger Peters Distinguished Faculty Award for teaching, research, and service. He's the author of America's Country Schools, Sacred Objects and Sacred Places, Preserving Tribal Traditions. Also the author of Boomtown Blues, Colorado's Oil Shale, which won the Colorado Book Award. He's edited a volume on preserving Western history that was voted one of the best books on the Southwest by the Tucson-Pima County Library. He also has a book on outdoors in the Southwest, an adventure anthology that likewise won a book award from Arizona and New Mexico. His book, The Woolly West, Colorado's Hidden History of Sheepscapes, that was published by Texas A&M University, was chosen as the Outstanding Nonfiction winner for the 2019 Wrangler Western Heritage Awards, and other recognition for that book. Andrew has led a number of tours across the West, traveling by foot, canoe, raft, horseback, van, cruise ship, not across the West, bus coach, etc. Anyway, and private jet. He's worked for the Smithsonian Institution, National Geographic Society, National Trust for Historic Preservation, variety of other organizations in that capacity. He's also won the National Individual Volunteer Award from the U.S. Forest Service for his work in wilderness education. With that, I think I noted that the book is available through the University of Utah Press outside the room when we're finished today. Let me thank the Cultural Vision Fund, whose support for the Wallace Stegner Center made this event possible today. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards, and the information to tune in through your phone using the Slido technology will be on the screen when we finish. With that, let me welcome, and please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Gulliford.
Well, it's great to be here with the snow on the ground instead of in the air blowing across my windshield as it did yesterday trying to get here. But what a snowpack. And looks like we've now made the snowpack that we had in 1983. 40 years, right on schedule. So that's exciting. I want to thank a number of folks before I get started for research assistance and research I did for the Bears Ears book. That would include Brigham Young University, the Charles Redd Center, all those archivists at the Marriott Library here on your campus. The Utah Historical Society staff was really helpful, as were the archivists at SITLA. That really helped me to put together my book, which winds up with 100 pages of endnotes and bibliography. And I've told my wife, no, I won't do that again. That was too much. But it took 20 years to research and write it. So Bears Ears, there's some folks here in the audience who've been on a couple of my tours. It's great to see them. And my wife and I were in Southeast Utah on the day that President Obama declared the 1.35 million acre Bears Ears National Monument. With a stroke of the president's pen, those serpentine canyons, mesas, meadows, and slick rock sanctuaries became a new national monument. Some local residents in San Juan County were furious, others were ecstatic. Let's look at the president's words. The first words in the proclamation are beautiful. He wrote, quote, "Rising from the center of the southeastern Utah landscape and visible from every direction are twin buttes so distinctive that in each of the native languages of the region, their names is the same, Bears Ears." And I think part of the motivation for writing my book was because there are folks who said, no, nobody has called it that. It's always been Cedar Mesa. That's just sort of a modern Native American invention for the place. And 20 years of research, I've proven that's not true at all. Bears Ears as a term they're in Spanish. It's on some of the oldest maps. It was certainly well known as Bears Ears. And in fact, in 1938, geologists suggested changing the name of the Elk Plateau to Bears Ears Plateau, which I still think would be a good idea. For the first time in the 110-year history of the Antiquities Act, and there are folks here with the Stegner Center who have written really excellent pieces on the Antiquities Act and Bears Ears, that the first time Native American tribes actively campaigned for a national monument. This is the first time Native tribes used a federal law to protect a landscape of deep meaning to them. And I think everyone needs to understand that's unique. It had never happened before. The law itself is fascinating. The Antiquities Act is only almost a page and a half. It's one of the shortest federal laws you'll ever see. And the interesting thing about it is there's language in there that says the president may withdraw from the public domain lands of scenic and historic and scientific value, quote, in the smallest acreage possible. Well, Teddy Roosevelt signed that law, and when the politicians couldn't decide on doing anything to protect the Grand Canyon, he did. He created Grand Canyon as a national monument at 800,000 acres. The folks in Arizona went apoplectic. How could a president do that? It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Theodore Roosevelt had actually passed on before the Supreme Court made its decision, and the Supreme Court unanimously said, yes, it's a presidential opportunity, and the president can declare the size of the monument. So we've already been to the Supreme Court with the size of a monument, and the Antiquities Act has stood that test. So it's an interesting law, and one that folks sometimes called a land grab, but it's not. Every single acre in Bears Ears was already public land, a mix of Forest Service, BLM primarily, and a little bit of Park Service with the Natural Bridges National Monument. Like, I hope many of you enjoy hiking and exploring in San Juan County. The sense of the past is real. I like discovering and photographing things and leaving them in place. So that's really the challenge. Yes, there have been and will continue to be legal challenges to Bears Ears, but one of the other challenges, and an important one, is the tourist impact. Can we have a space that big and leave things on that landscape? Mesa Verde, for instance, you'll never find it potsherd. You'll never, everything, the whole region's been swept clean, and the Park Service has very strict rules about where you can go. That's not true in Bears Ears, which is part of the BLM's national conservation lands. Yes, there are rules, but certainly not the paved trails and the set-aside interpretive signs. That hasn't happened yet. And many of us don't want it to happen. We want it to be a place of exploration, inquiry, a place where, you might get lost. Well, so what? Then you'll get found. It's just really going to be interesting for Utah and for the United States to see how Bears Ears develops with what we hope will be continual tribal co-management. San Juan County itself is amazing. I live in Durango, teach in Durango. We have a house in Bluff. When I'm in Durango, I'm a Durangatang. And when I'm in Bluff, I'm a Bluffoon. And as a San Juan County taxpayer, some of the locals call folks like us, quote, we're local outsiders. And I like that phrase. I'm a local, but I'm outside as much as I can, so I'll accept that. San Juan County is 7,804 square miles. Only 8% of it is private land. It's a gigantic amount of public and tribal land. And there's so many things there. State parks, Grand Gulch, Valley of the Gods, Monument Valley, the Moki Dugway, Muley Point, Sand Island, and now Bears Ears. And I've got to quote Terry Tempest Williams about that attraction to that red rock landscape. She wrote in her book, Red, Passion and Patience in the Desert, quote, "For as far as I can see, the canyon country of southern Utah extends in all directions. No compass can orient me here, only a pledge to love and walk the terrifying distances before me. What I fear and desire most in this world is passion. I fear it because it promises to be spontaneous, out of my control, unnamed, beyond my reasonable self. I desire it because passion has color, like the landscape before me. It is not pale, it is not neutral, it reveals the backside of the heart. As the world becomes more crowded and corroded by consumption and capitalism, this landscape of minimalism will take on greater significance, reminding us that through its blood-red grandeur, just how essential wild country is to our psychology, how precious the desert is to the soul of America. And in my book, and in the history of Bears Ears, there are all sorts of people on the fringe, and the subtitle, Bears Ears, the Landscape of Refuge and Resistance. As a historian, I've covered national topics and done things over broad sweeps of geography. Never have I spent so much time in one place, in one county, writing a book just about the history of that area. But that's how big San Juan County is. There's only 16,000 residents. 57% are Native American. And the voting issues have been real in terms of voter suppression, but now most of that is worked out. The county is huge. It's almost the size of Massachusetts. It has 2 stoplights, but really only one, because one of those stoplights blinks. So in terms of a full 4-way stop, 1 stoplight. And, the last time I was here doing research at the Marriott Library, one of the kind librarians came up to me and said, are you going back to Bluff today? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, you probably ought to go now. And I said, why? And she said, have you ever been to one of our football games? And I said, no. And she said, well, it's about to end in half an hour. If you want to get out of Salt Lake City tonight, you better leave now. So I took the message. And so think about that. Think about a place with only 1 stoplight compared to your urban suburban traffic here on the Wasatch Front. And think about a place where there are still artifacts. There are still sherds. There are still things on the landscape. We had a student group in Bears Ears last weekend. They found stuff, and I had already told them, if you find anything, put it a couple of inches back in the dirt. Don't leave it out. One of the problems at the sites that the BLM has, quote, hardened, is people think it's a good idea if you find a little piece of broken arrowhead or a broken piece of pottery to put it on a rock so that other people can see it. No, because other people will take it. So, that notion of a museum rock is heartfelt, but it's the wrong idea, because people say, oh, look, there's 6 little fragments here. I'll just take 1. So no, it's much better to just disperse stuff, and our students did from their trip. But think about that history, 11,000 years of history in one place. And we have in San Juan County, Utah, at Sand Island Campground, a petroglyph of a woolly mammoth. And there are people who disagree with that, but I really think it's there. It's an 11,000-year-old petroglyph. And it's not something somebody made up, because if they had to have seen a mammoth in order to get the top knot right, the spread of the tusks, the way the trunk has a bifurcated, somebody had to have seen a mammoth to draw that petroglyph. There are folks who say, no, the cliff isn't old enough, it's sandstone, but I think it's there. And how amazing is that? So part of the idea of refuge is not only where is Bears Ears, what is Bears Ears, but what has it been historically? And it's been a place of refuge. Paleo Indians were there, then prehistoric Native Americans, centuries of ancestral Puebloans. When they abandoned the area by 1300, Navajos and Utes moved in around 1400 or 1450. So what's fascinating about Bears Ears, it was always on the edge. It was always the edge of the Navajo world. it was the edge of it's the northwest edge of the ancestral Puebloan world. It was the northern edge of the Navajo cultural area. Utes were all over Utah, but still, it was a boundary for the Utes. And now, politically, Bears Ears has moved to the center. It's not the edge anymore. It's at the center of these political disputes over federal land, public land, state authority over federal land. And that's not over because our Utah congressional delegation is suing the Biden administration because the Obama administration established Bears Ears. The Trump administration shrunk it by 85%. Although, and maybe somebody in this room can help me with this, while President Trump was shrinking Bears Ears, he also added 11,000 acres near Indian Creek. And I'd still like to know whose idea that was. And so when President Biden restored it, he kept Trump's 11,000 acres. So it's actually bigger than it was before, which I think is great. So the Navajo history is so important because Bears Ears was a place of refuge hiding from Kit Carson's troops. And so the famous Navajos who were born near Bears Ears, Manuelito, Kilgalia, that was their place to get away from things, between that and Navajo Mountain. The concept of palimpsest, I think, is so important. Cultural layers upon layers. When the LDS Church encourages settlement in southeast Utah, at Moab and at Bluff, particularly to keep out those dang Coloradans who were moving, the fact there was a railroad access coming to Durango. And so the Hole in the Rock expedition is an extraordinary piece of Utah history, Western history, the largest wagon train ever to move east. And then at the top of San Juan Hill, the inscription, quote, "We thank thee, O God," after all that travail. It's just an amazing place. And so it becomes a place of resistance for Mormon pioneers, just as it was for Navajos trying to avoid the federal government. All of this in the same place. It's just really an amazing landscape. Bluff itself has a Chacoan great house. And there are two large alcoves across the river, which Hopi say that's why the great house was here. And, those alcoves are still there. In terms of population, we've got a sign as you enter Bluff, Utah, that says Bluff, Utah, established 650 AD. Well, some of the Mormon pioneer families take umbrage with that, but it's true. There were people there. What's interesting is Bluff's population right now is 250 people. There were probably 2,500 people in the Bluff Valley 1,000 years ago. So it's one of those rare places where there's fewer people now than there was then. During the day, visitors can hike ancient trails in deep sandstone canyons. At night, you can explore the universe. The first National Park Service dark sky park is Natural Bridges, which is right next to Bears Ears. Quote, "From earth to sky, the region is unsurpassed in wonders. The star-filled nights and natural quiet of the Bears Ears area transport visitors to an earlier eon. Against an absolutely black night sky, our galaxy and others more distant leap into view as one of the most intact and vast roadless areas in the contiguous United States. Bears Ears has that rare and arresting quality of deafening silence." That's also from the proclamation. But I learned so much in researching the book. Part of it was an attempt to establish a nuclear waste dump right on the edge of Canyonlands, and going back through the papers trying to find all that and whose idea that was. It took 3 different Utah governors to put that idea to bed. And when I started my teaching career in Silt, Colorado, a little town along the Colorado River, that when I started, the town still had dirt streets and wooden water lines. And we would come down south of Tucson for Christmas and come back up through Monument Valley and Bears Ears. And I'll never forget going through, I can't remember whether it was Blanding or Monticello, and seeing a petition at the gas station. In those days, you had to go in and pay gas at the inside. And there was a petition that said, please let us have a nuclear waste dump. And I said, this is a joke, right? You don't really mean this. Oh, no, we really mean this. So all of that history, those layers over time, I think are so important. And now 100,000 archaeological sites, perhaps, probably more in one place. And the question is, how will it be managed? How will it be protected? What will the tribes have to say? It's pretty exciting stuff. So I'd like to read a little from my book, and I'd like to start off on a ledge. It has been years now since I cowered on that ledge with the canyon bottom hundreds of feet below me and the cliff top hundreds of feet above. I was terrified, unable to move from fear. Oh, I could continue to crawl all right, but the 4-foot ledge angled out toward a sheer drop-off, perhaps 500 feet below. Ravens made large turns below me and then slowly ascended in updrafts. There was no way to stand up. My heart pounded against my rib cage. Sweat ran off my hands. I could not swallow, and we still had not made it around the corner to the ancestral pueblo in ruin we sought. The morning had started off in bright sunlight, a spring breeze, a walk to the edge of a cliff. With binoculars, we stared down at a thin ledge on a sandstone cliff with a stacked stone mortared wall as a barrier to entry, then a habitation room block, an even narrower ledge, and a small room with a still sealed ancestral puebloan door. Something had been piled near the room, but even with the best of binoculars, it was hard to tell what the objects were. We stared, laughed a little nervously, and agreed that, sure, we would try to walk that ledge. My happy lab pup had no idea what we were planning. He was just glad to be outdoors in canyon country with plenty of fresh smells and small sandstone pockets of water. As we began our descent a mile or so distant from the ruin we had spotted, I wondered how difficult the trail would be. And then I realized there was no trail. Where we were headed, no one had been in years. Visualizing those sheer angles of the cliffs and the narrowness of the ledge, I knew why. My friends had spotted this remote ruin. Finally, I had to tie the dog up, and away we went. And imagine hiking on a clamshell. So first, as we approached this ruin, I realized on the ground, and it's a 500-foot drop-off, the ground is covered with little pebbles. Now, whether somebody put them there or whether they just got there over the centuries, I can't tell, but there was no way to look up. You had to look down to make sure you didn't slide off the cliff, which was really good if you were an archer behind the defensive wall because you weren't looking at the archer. Finally, we got behind that wall. Finally, we got a little farther along, and then the trail on the ledge disappeared. The whole ledge came down like a clamshell, which was bad enough, except it tilted out. So I am terrified, and I've lost control. I'm a nervous wreck. The only way I can think of to begin to, restore my nervous system, I got out my binoculars, and I'm looking around, pretending that things are closer than they are, and I'm not as terrified as I am. Oh, those ravens aren't that far away. The ground isn't that far. I had to slow down my heartbeat. I finally did. We crawled the rest of it, managed to stand up again, and then looked out at this site, looked out from it. Imagine, going into a room and looking out and realizing, that's why they have windows on 10-story buildings. Amazing. And when we finally got back, What a relief. I thought about how being in the middle of a 10-floor skyscraper and poking my head and shoulders out of a window that should not have been open. I'll never forget the view, the silence, and the golden afternoon light upon the cliffs. I knew we would have to return the dangerous way we had come, but not quite yet. We had earned this silence and solitude. Few people had ever crawled in here in the last 800 years. We savored those precious moments of personal discovery. Then came the hard part, turning around. We made it out easily enough. We had a few scratches and bruises, but no one panicked and no one fell. I cannot imagine how hard it would have been to take that route every twilight after farming small patches of corn on the canyon rim. Hauling water was women's work, and I can barely conceive of the poise and balance it would have taken girls and women to bring cool pottery jars full of water along that dangerous ledge. When we finally made it back to the curve of the canyon with tree limbs to touch, we were laughing and joking, stunned by our own accomplishment and in awe of the persistence and determination of the elders. My lab was overjoyed to see me and vowed never to leave me again. He didn't. We spent the next 12 years hiking canyon country, and he never left my side. I promised my wife I would never go where my dog wouldn't go, but I did not tell her that he had four-paw drive and an excellent sense of balance. Yeah, the University of Utah Press sent that out to reviewers, and one of the reviewers' comments on the manuscript was, "You got to explain these dogs a little better." So the introduction talks about the different dogs I've taken into Bears Ears and their personalities. So it's just an amazing place. And one of the amazing women who helped give cohesion to Bears Ears, Alice Eastwood, is a famous botanist. And she was from Canada, went to high school in Denver, owned property in Denver and Durango, sold it, made enough money to just botanize. And she is really important in Southwest history, prehistory, because she is the one who introduces Gustav Nordenskjöld to the Wetherells and to Mesa Verde. And as a botanist, she is the one, as the Wetherells are finding things at Mesa Verde, she is the one who's identifying the plants. And then at a certain point, she takes the train that comes, north of Moab at Crescent Junction, and then rides horseback from basically Crescent Junction all the way back down into Bears Ears. Before there were some small little Mormon communities, but basically nobody was there. And what an interesting woman. She had to invent her own skirt because this is the Victorian era. Women are not supposed to ride, on a horse, on a saddle. So she invented her own split skirt so she could ride horseback. She's the first botanist collecting plants in Southeast Utah, and is there with a single man, one of the Wetherell brothers. That was scandalous. She has a great time. She collects plants in Courthouse Wash, now part of Arches, all the way through Bears Ears. And so her history is really tied to this location. And, what an amazing woman for all the things that she winds up collecting and getting plants named after her. She lives to be 94. In California, she winds up at the California Academy of Sciences. Alice Eastwood named 125 new plant species. In her lifetime, she wrote 310 scientific articles, named 395 plant species, and had 17 species named for her. At age 68, on a botany trip in California, she walked 20 miles the first day and 10 miles on day 2. She officially retired at age 90. All these plants, and then she's there in San Francisco the same year the Antiquities Act is signed, which is the same year of the earthquake. The city's on fire, buildings are collapsing, and she is worried about her plant specimens. Literally, the staircase is crumbling in the building. She's saving them from the California Academy of Sciences. And, she goes on to say that she lost all of her personal possessions, but she saves the plants. She hurried into the collapsing building to climb 5 stories of twisted railing on broken stairs to retrieve 1,497 specimens, fires erupting down the block. She retrieved the Academy's historic records and irreplaceable botanical specimens. She wrote, quote, "My own destroyed work I do not lament, but it was a joy to me while I did it, and I can still have the same joy in starting it again." Wow, what kind of inspiration is that? On a lesser note, but equally important, is a document I found at BYU in Special Collections. I was looking for this document, took a while to find it. I'd heard about it, but it's a catalog. It's a catalog of pot hunting. And this is pre the Antiquities Act. There were no rules. The pamphlet is old and faded. Staples have been removed, but the title and date are unmistakable. In capital letters, quote, "Catalog and description of a very large collection of prehistoric relics obtained in the cliff houses and caves of southeastern Utah. This collection is for sale. Address McLeod and Graham, P.O. Box 312, Durango, Colorado. Explorers of prehistoric ruins and collectors of relics, 1894. Here's where history comes in, because 1893 is a major depression in the United States. Businesses have failed, banks have failed, railroads are failing, and there's no market for cattle and sheep. So cowboys turned to pot hunting, and these were miners who turned to pot hunting. And this catalog enumerates every single thing they have for sale, and unfortunately, a lot of it are body parts. Because of all the things to collect, what everyone seems most interested in are, quote, mummies. So pot hunting, unfortunately, has been going on in Bears Ears a very long time. And as President Biden's proclamation enumerates, it's Bears Ears and the pot hunting that helped inspire the Antiquities Act. Because the Wetherill brothers are not only going to dig in Grand Gulch and Bears Ears, they're going to then move their work to Chaco Canyon, and that's where they will be caught. And that's where the whole real issue of the need for an Antiquities Act comes into focus, but they were there. So this catalog is pretty awful in terms of what it enumerates, and items are listed. Number 1, headless mummy of female child that was found in Lake Canyon, followed by number 2, a well-preserved mummy, 5 feet 6 inches in length, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the history too, and it's a part of the history that we can't and should not ignore. Then, just the whole world of resistance, as the pioneer settlers are there, getting the little towns established, they've abandoned Bluff and pretty much moved up towards Blanding and Monticello, left Bluff alone. The river kept flooding. The San Juan River had no dams, it kept flooding. And so they're settled and doing pretty well with cattle and sheep early on. And then Teddy Roosevelt also starts the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. And part of the rules and regulations for the Forest Service will be grazing fees. And that is a very contentious issue. And one of the first forest rangers is none other than Jacob Riis's son. So Jacob Riis was a pioneer photographer in urban New York City, helped explain issues with poverty and the beginnings of an urban renewal movement. Pretty interesting guy. This is his son who was attracted to the Forest Service because of Gifford Pinchot. He is the first forest ranger on the Manti La Salle in Monticello, and it's a weekend, and he's in his cabin reading in his underwear. And the underwear back then was probably, red long johns, right? Anyway, all of a sudden he is accosted by an armed rancher. Parley Butts, B-U-T-T-S, with 4 adult sons in tow, stormed into Reese's cabin one morning and shouted, "We cowmen came into this country before Uncle Sam even thought it worth looking at. When God finished making the world, he had a lot of rocks left over, and he threw them down here in a pile in Utah. But we took it and settled it. We've killed off the Indians and the rattlesnakes and built roads and bridges to get in here. We've put up with all hell and damnation to make our homes here, and never a bit of help did we get from Uncle Sam while we were doing it. Now, when we get the country halfway fit to live in, you come in here and tell us how much grass we can have, and that we have got to pay for it, and that we can put our cows on this here mountain for so long and no longer. By God, we will like hell. This is our country, and we aim to keep it." Now, if someone said that to you while you were in your underwear, a little compromising, but Mr. Reese said, "You know, Parley, you can shoot me, but there'll be another forest ranger come along. You can't go to war with the U.S. government. Well, let's sit down and talk about this." Because indeed, there had been much overgrazing in the Bears Ears area, and that's an issue still being dealt with. But the fun part about being an historian is I don't have to make anything up. All I have to do is find it. All I have to do is research it. The voices are there, the people are there, the stories are there. You just have to keep looking. And so that was the fun part of the book. And the research is putting it all together, finding these connections between, Navajo people, Anglos who spoke fluent Navajo, all of the stories related to Bears Ears. Even the writer Ernie Pyle made it to Bluff in 1934. And he joked about it in one of his columns. He said, I really felt we needed to get there before Eleanor Roosevelt did. Well, she never went there. And so he says, we had to outfit the car. Quote, "When we started that long trip into the desert country, we prepared ourselves as though we were going from the Cape to Cairo. And so they outfitted their car with new tires, a shovel, a 5-gallon water can for the car's radiator, and a gallon of water for the pair of them. They bought a tire pump, tire patches, extra fan belts, extra oil, gunny sacks, a snake bite kit, a first aid kit, a pistol and a rifle, and a block of wood to balance a tire jack on in soft sand." Who's been to Bears Ears? Did you bring all that stuff? It's important to have stuff. Quote, "Of all this paraphernalia, we had no need for anything except the 2 cans of water, the funnel, and a tin cup. We never saw a snake. We never saw anything to shoot at except some prairie dogs. We didn't eat our sardines, and the fan belt didn't break." But Pyle cautioned, "Yet, if I was making the trip again, I wouldn't eliminate a thing, for it is possible to need all those things in the desert, and when you need them bad." So, great. He also went on to judge which roads were worse, those in Utah or Arizona, and he completely decided they were worse in Utah. So I want to show some slides, but I have to give you this quote. This is from Charlie Steen, who makes modern Moab the uranium king. And you and I, as taxpayers, are paying for his successes because of the uranium cleanup along the Colorado River, big environmental mistake. But when he opened that Atlas mill, this is what he said at the dedication. Steen joked, quote, "Prospectors whose sun-blistered brow, bunioned feet, seatless pants, croc haircuts, and insanely glittering eyes show that they have qualified as bone-fried desert country-type prospectors and uranium hounds, thoroughly tested by blazing suns, freezing winds, reddish sandstorms, hungry scorpions, and the tall tales of crossroad and country seat barroom liars and promoters, prospectors who have blistered their rumps riding burros and jeeps, have gone without baths and women, have trekked over deserts, climbed buttes, swum rivers, run rapids, and jumped arroyos, not to mention a few claims." That's the other part of Bears Ears history is the uranium mine. And I said there was an attempt for a nuclear waste dump. The whole county changes because of uranium. And in fact, uranium is one of the issues why President Trump removed 85% of it, thinking there might be some future in uranium mining. And in fact, the nation's last licensed uranium mill is still there, just south of Blanding. All right, let's show some pictures. Bears Ears, really prominent. So this is one of the meadows behind Bears Ears. The top of the comb, a place I love to be. Should be 68 degrees, I think, Saturday. Native consultation is so important. This is Peter Pino. We work together on the Mesa Verde Foundation board. This is a drawing from a photograph of the mammoth. And you see what I mean about the bifurcated trunk and the tusks. And so in Bluff, we had our own little Burning Man, only it was animals. And pre-COVID, we'd have big get-togethers and a wild December 21st solstice, and built this mammoth and then set him on fire with, and you're going to love this, with flaming atlatl darts. So the rock art is thousands of years old, and just like Grand Canyon River Guides, for an extra tip, will carve, make little willow figurines, so did the people who did the rock art. This is a place called Tipped Over Rock. To actually photograph this, the rock is like this. I had to lean over all the way on the edge. This is Glen Canyon linear, distinctive style. The connection to Chaco is important. New research includes information that there were sandal patterns from Chaco, which were replicated by Chaco immigrants fleeing Chaco but moving into Bears Ears. One of the really interesting spots you can get to. The last 20 feet are a little sketchy, but so what a landscape to save. And so different from Mesa Verde, where designated tours, designated parking. Here, you've got to hike to find things. I named this Sunset House because it faces west. Very, very few refuge sites face west. I found all sorts of things, reburied them. This is called a Christmas tree point. It's actually a spear point. The rock art there's probably enough rock art within 5 miles of Bluff for a World Heritage Site designation. There's just thousands of individual pieces. I love handprints, but these are real special. These are negative handprints where the artist had the paint in his or her mouth and then spat it out, so that's their hand, as opposed to a positive print that you put the paint on just on your hand. The procession panel, over 100 little figures are going to the same place, which is probably the circle here, a symbol of the great Kiva. Historic photographs show the perseverance of the LDS pioneers and the canyons they had to get through. Places, as I say, where you can hike to today, but boy, be careful. So, the first map makers, Dominguez and Escalante coming through. And how close did they get? Not too close, but close enough. Wolf Killer, a Navajo. Louisa Wetherill was fluent in Navajo. She took his oral history, and the grandson finally published the book called Wolf Killer. Really interesting account of things around Navajo Mountain. One of the Hatali, or medicine men. Hashkanini himself, who was the most important person as Navajos came back into the Four Corners after coming back from Bosque Redondo. He had been called the Angry One because his little band had to really work very, very hard to survive. And yet, when other Navajos finally come back into the area, his name changes to the Generous One because he's able to give them sheep. Here's Louisa Wetherell, the incredible translator. When she dies, when Hashkanini dies, she is so important in the community that she is his executor and has to make all these decisions about his property. He doesn't tell her that one of the things he has gifted her, she finds out at dawn when at her trading post at Kayenta, 34 women, Ute women, are surrounding the trading post, crying and keening. She has no idea what's going on. They were wives of Hashkanini, which they were slave women, and he gave them to her. And I couldn't believe that number. I had to go back and check with the family, and the story's true, and so was that number. So then she had to support them and build another hogan for them. There are historic artifacts right there in Bears Ears that are so important, like a Navajo hogan, male hogan. The sacred mountains are significant. This is one of them. This is Hesperus near Durango. And the Navajo sort of hearth, cultural hearth, is southeast of Farmington, New Mexico, a place called Dinata, and Pueblitos, a real interesting mix of both a Navajo and a Pueblo house design. It's here where the Navajo people developed their songs and ceremonies before moving farther west. Navajo horses, glyphs on top of much older ancestral Puebloan spirals. This is a site named Hobbs Ruin after one of the Mormon scouts. And the first bishop there at Bluff, Jens Nielsen, who had survived the trek across with the hand carts. And some of the great old houses in Bluff built by these Mormon pioneers. An interesting rock outcropping that has different names right along Combe Ridge. And Richard Wetherell, whose nickname from the Navajos was Anasazi. Here's Alice Eastwood, the famous botanist with that jaunty little smile. And the Wetherells deep in Grand Gulch, basically pot hunting. Luckily, some of these collections have surfaced. They are in public museums where they can now be researched. I love maps. My book has 75 photos. I want to thank the University of Utah Press for allowing that. And then also 15 maps, but the scale won't get you anywhere, but they're really fun to look at, especially the historic ones. So look, there's Bears Ears at the top, Orejas del Oso in Spanish. Posey, this is the 100th anniversary of the Posey War, March of 1923, a sad story of Utes being killed near Blanding, and then Posey retreating into Bears Ears, where he died. This is a pretty powerful photograph. Utes were forced into a World War I style stockade for 5 weeks. This is 1923. Native Americans are not yet citizens. They have no legal rights. The Indian agent is on the far left over here. He did nothing. It's a pretty poignant piece of Utah history. Along comes Charles Bernheimer, a wealthy New Yorker who wants to fund expeditions. He's in Bears Ears a lot. And then, this is interesting, there was a plan for a Navajo National Park that didn't bother to ask the Navajos about it. And luckily this didn't happen, but look at how complete this plan is. So many sites to go visit. This is one called Two Story House. And then we have a group, a totally different commune, folks showing up in the 1930s. Marie Ogden, who starts this commune and in Dry Valley, which is what you pass through on your way to Indian Creek, where she said the weather was going to change, Jesus was returning, and commanded her followers to be vegans, although they could eat fish. Well, there's not a lot of fish south of Moab, so I'm not exactly sure what they ate. Everett Roos, one of the more famous people to have gone missing here in Utah. One of the last photographs of him. He was through Bluff. And then the first sort of student group into Dark Canyon, now one of a wilderness area. Establishment of the Episcopal Mission with Father Liebler. Kent Frost, his papers are here at the University of Utah Marriott Library. I was really found some great things in there, including this image of Katie Lee, who liked to walk around the canyons wearing red Ked tennis shoes and a hat and nothing else. The road, the original road before New Highway 95, you can see that cut. That was it. At Abbey, this is what Abbey wanted to keep, and it didn't work. Where the belt of uranium mining was. And here's Charlie Steen himself, who went from rags to riches to rags. At one point, he was grossing $50,000 a week with his mining and his mill. Uranium miner from Southeast Utah. The monument number 2, continuing issues with Navajo exposure to radioactivity. This is in San Juan County, and nobody told them about radioactivity at all. The book about this is called Yellow Dirt, which is the Navajo translation of uranium ore. Abby, who fought against the highway, 95, the Bicentennial Highway. And Cal Black, who was all for it, one of the more prominent of the San Juan County commissioners. He's on the far left. And where a nuclear waste dump would have been sited, and you can see Moab, you can see Monticello, basically right on the northeast edge of Bears Ears. And radioactive material for 250,000 years was what was planned. Luckily, it didn't happen. Heidi Red, one of the great cowgirls from Southeast Utah. The Red Ranch is now owned by the Nature Conservancy, the Dugout Ranch, and she was just inducted into the Cowgirls Hall of Fame. The folks who built the Recapture Lodge, here they are. They were certainly a lot of fun, Gene Fouché and his wife. And somebody mentioned early on the Great Old Broads. Here was a photo pose to protect Bears Ears, which worked. And opposition against it is still there locally. And it's interesting. It's federal land. It's a presidential declaration. We'll see what happens. So thank you very much. Happy to entertain questions. And
we do have some, Andrew. Thank you very much, both for the historical background and for the slides. I'll share some questions with you if there are other ones. Slido should be up in a moment. From your perspective, how relationships of the tribal nations and the Pueblos with the land changed or transformed over time?
How have the relationships
of the tribal nations and the Pueblos, their relationships with the land changed or evolved over time?
Okay, that's a pretty interesting question. So At one point, there was an attempt to turn almost all of southeast Utah, San Juan County, into a Ute Indian reservation. And the Utes were in favor of that. It didn't happen. But their connections to it are really ancient. So certainly there for the Pueblos and the Puebloan tribes. Navajos have done research, and in the 1940s, there was some dendrochronology on hogans and really dating some of the wood. So their relationship to that landscape goes back centuries. So I think part of that question is also the tribal relations to each other. And so this is one of the other amazing things about Bears Ears. It has brought these tribes together. So the 5 tribes who are committed to preserving Bears Ears are the Navajo Nation, the Hopis, Zunis, Ute Mountain Ute, and then Northern Ute. And so they are committed to this as an ancestral homeland. And the question is, because the other managers are Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and Park Service, how will that work? And we'll find out. And so obviously there's hunting, wood gathering, other kinds of plant gathering. Those are traditional uses. Those are written into the proclamation. Also, Bears Ears is the only place where rock climbing is written into the proclamation. So we'll see. But there is a lot of camaraderie over this spot.
A quick question, if you have your book there, someone asked for the page number on the quote regarding Harley in his underwear. You can get that real quick.
Yeah. Page 171.
171 on the quote. Based on the intergovernmental cooperative agreement signed between the 5 tribes and the 2 federal agencies regarding management of the monument, can you tell us how your work can inform the current planning process for Bears Ears?
Well, as a historian and as what's called a public historian, history is so significant, especially with Bears Ears, to show and to prove this tribal relationship. There were a number of lawsuits that I was able to research. There was an attempt, so the BLM doesn't exist until 1946, and there's an attempt in the early 1950s to remove Navajo livestock and Navajos who are living along Comb Ridge. And I consider this, a civil rights issue, but there were no TV cameras. There were, those cameras were all in Birmingham, Alabama, and other places in the South. But the Navajos were forcibly removed. And the legal case goes all the way to the Utah Supreme Court. But the lawyers for the Navajos say, look, this has been our place since time immemorial. And so the reason history is so important is it proves things that are now being discussed. And if people doubt that there's any validity, a good history helps to show, look, here's what happened, decades ago. This is why Native peoples today are so concerned about proper management. So that's really important. All of the history of pot hunting I tried to chronicle, and it's a grim history, but it's in here. The first big pot hunting raid in the country was 1986. Other things happened, obviously, in 2009. So to have it all in one book, I think, is going to be hopefully useful for land managers to understand what's happened on this landscape.
Thank you. Can you address the Utah Attorney General's office's specific contention in its case against the federal government that artifacts can be more effectively preserved if boundaries are more specifically drawn?
That is not possible. I think it's important to look at a earlier designation. So whoever's researching this needs to look at Canyons of the Ancients National Monument and remarks by Secretary of the Interior and Harvard Law School attorney Bruce Babbitt, as he's moving to position BLM more into these national conservation lands, he describes at a University of Denver Law School talk, and then in the proclamation itself, that we're really looking at landscapes, not sites, that you can't understand a culture by finding an arrowhead and drawing a square around it and saying this is a site. That you really need to look at distances, you need to look at large landscapes. So Canyons of the Ancients was the first such designation, and Bears Ears is equally important, perhaps even more so because of this tribal consultation. So you can't just take a landscape of 1.35 million acres, slice it up into little boxes and say, this is what we're preserving. No, it has to be the landscape itself. And I think it's so important to let the tribes comment on that. And the Utah Attorney General needs to allow that.
And one final question. Can you speak to the conflicts, if any, between preservation of the Bears Ears landscape and oil and gas leases? And do you have any suggestions for going forward on that issue?
So one of the things that a national monument does is it withdraws from mineral entry, oil and gas, and mining. So traditional uses, hunting continues, grazing continues. So the oil and gas issue is stopped with a national monument designation. But I can show folks many pipes and dates on those pipes where oil and gas exploration occurred and nothing was found. And the last time there was a well drilled, nothing was found. It's not there.
It looks like we've got one other question.
Yeah, I'm working with the Utah Denabakai on the water. I'd just like to mention a water connection here. I've learned from Willie Gray Eyes, Maryboy Brothers, and others that there are sacred water sites on the mountain, 3 lakes, 4 lakes, and that is part, I think, as you consider the long-term values, there is a water value there that is going through the Utah settlement of water. So I just wanted to mention 4 sacred lakes. I don't know the names, I can't speak the names, but it is an integral part of this whole area.
Absolutely. Thanks for that comment.
Andrew, I had read that when the Mormon pioneers went into Escalante Valley, there were Paiute living there, harvesting the potatoes. Why isn't that the Paiutes weren't involved in the tribal consultation? Do you have any idea?
So they are. So there is a high percentage of Paiute ancestry and blood with Ute Mountain Ute, because the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, even though its headquarters is in Toyac, also is the sort of tribal administrator for the White Mesa Utes, and they're historically at least half Paiute.
Can you discuss that a little bit further, please?
Okay, so the question is about overgrazing. So there's continuing to be new research on overgrazing and what happens when you've got cattle or sheep in the wrong place for too long. Many sites in Bears Ears have been damaged by livestock. Some of the good things that volunteers have done is we've been able to do sort of fences to keep tight canyons to keep livestock out of those canyons, but they're still there, and they're still knocking down walls and some of the Navajo hogans. The effects on the landscape, though, are there's very little left of bunch grass, a lot of cheatgrass, acres and acres of Russian thistles. It's pretty denuded. And you can see that because as you park around Butler Wash or Comb Wash, and then as you get higher up, there's a whole different plant community, and the altitude's not that much different. So it's just years of a lot of livestock. So that's the problem. And yet that's also one of the things that BLM deals with, because these are national conservation lands and traditional uses are sort of grandfathered into the designations. So grazing is part of the National Monuments Proclamation. So the real question will be, can it be done in a better way, and can some of the landscapes be restored? And BLM is dealing with that on the 37 million acres in this National Conservation Landscape System, and Bears Ears is a part of that. So part of it is, getting cattle in and out before they do too much damage. Nobody's really raising sheep anymore. One of my books is called The Woolly West, and there's just not many sheep on public land, at least in the Southwest. And so, things can recover given time.
With that, let me thank you, Andrew, for this wonderful presentation on Bears Ears. Let me thank everyone for joining us today. Let me remind you, we have two presentations next week on Tuesday and Wednesday, one on the young Wallace Stegner's correspondence, the other a film on Stuart Udall and his tenure as Secretary, his life, including his tenure as Secretary of the Interior. Andrew's book is for sale through the University of Utah Press outside. And let me also thank the Cultural Vision Fund again for their support of this event. With that, please join us next week, and thank everyone again.
Thank you.